I am struck that I need my notes. I'm struck that today marks the start of Advent, and that Advent is a waiting season, and yet we seem to be running out of hanging about and waiting for things to change time. I have to hope that there's more to Advent than just sitting about, twiddling our collective thumbs, playing our collective fiddles while the world is on fire. And by fiddle, I don't just mean that musical instrument. I'm talking about too many people in the world being on the fiddle, not just playing the fiddle. I'm struck that our gospel reading today speaks in big picture apocalyptic terms of strange things happening to the sun, to the moon, and to the stars, of whole countries being in despair, of the roar of the seas and of rising tides. And I'm struck that we're living right in the middle of these strange times. Perhaps it always was, perhaps it always will be. But that we need to be alert and to pray always that we will have the strength to go safely through all these things that are happening and will happen. And I'm struck, and I have to say not a little bit intimidated, that my brief words this morning, my reflections on COP26, are located between two hymns. The first is a lament. Hear the song of our lament. And the second is there is hope. And I'm not sure that on this first Sunday of Lent, when we think about hope, that I will be particularly successful in taking us from the place of lament to the place of hope. I say this as someone who was present within the blue zone, or within the zone where the formal negotiations were ongoing throughout COP. And yet, for me, the most alive I always felt was in that space was on the Friday morning, joining 1,000 other delegates in the People's Plenary, and then with them walking out of the blue zone and joining a protest outside the steel perimeter. A lament that we once again had failed the poorest and the planet. So perhaps hope happens, not when we move from lament, but in the midst of it. Before I go any further, I want to tell you a story. A story which has in many ways shaped my life over the last 25 years. It's a story that I tell often, so sorry if it's a story that you've heard before. In 1997, we spent 3 months as a young family in southeast Brazil. I was there to seek to learn from the Christian church in that part of the world. And so in every conversation I had, I tended to include this question. I tended to say, what might the church in your part of the world offer or teach the church in my part of the world? One afternoon, I asked that question of a woman living in a wood and cardboard shack in a shanty town. And that shanty town had a population of about 350,000 people living in similar squalor. Her reply to me was immediate. "We can teach you about hope, Martin," she said. My confusion must have been equally immediate. I was sitting in the one chair in that shack, probably drinking from the one unbroken cup. The stench of the open sewer made you gag. She saw my confusion. "Martin," she said, "you're confusing optimism with hope. Here there are no grounds for optimism, because here people die every day. But still there are grounds for hope. For hope is a gift from God." Interesting. Well, actually more than interesting. Insightful. A way of seeing the world differently. Seeing the same devastation through different lenses. Or recognizing hope in the midst of despair. Perhaps you understand why that story has become perhaps the seminal story of my life. Depending on who you listen to, COP26 was either a complete failure, just more blah, 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 or it was part of a trajectory towards treating the greatest threat humanity has yet faced more seriously, but not seriously enough. No one is claiming that it was a great success. The seismic shift that changed the course of human history did not happen in Glasgow, despite the best efforts of many. And none of the wonderful people from the global south that I spoke to or listened to, including Vanessa, whose speech was amongst the most powerful I have ever heard. None of them expected that to be the case. They knew that with the largest single delegation present, being those who represented fossil fuel companies, the wisdom of those whose land is disappearing, ravaged by rising tides or raging fires, was never going to be the dominant experience that it needs to be before the nations can put their interests of people and planet before the selfishness of the wealthy, populist nationalism, and economic growth. I found my early days in the COP confusing and excluding. It reminded me of a giant trade show. Think of the Ideal Homes exhibition on steroids. It felt more like that than a gathering of people trying to seek to save the planet. It was promoted as being the most inclusive COP ever. And yet the ravages of COVID meant that some of the very poorest nations were hardly even able to be there. Whilst the phallic pavilions of the powerful told false stories, painted false images, offered false optimism. And optimism is often the preventer of hope rather than its midwife. Of course, there was truth-telling, but you had to search. It tended to be at the edges, rarely making it to the center stage. Truth-telling stood out because it wasn't the norm when and where it needed to be. I attended one session where the representative from OPEC, rich oil-producing countries, made the case that it was vital that they continued to extract oil so that the poor would not suffer. Perhaps it was for that reason. Maybe also because I didn't understand much of what was going on, that I always felt more comfortable on the outside, at the edge, outside the blue zone, particularly hanging out with inspirational young people from this country and across the world, and with people of faith from some of those places that don't need to imagine what climate catastrophe will look like, for they already see it every day. Perhaps that's why I bawled my lungs out on the Global Day of Action, privileged to be one of an estimated 150,000 people marching through the streets of Glasgow, crying out for climate justice now. A penny began to drop in my very little brain that Saturday afternoon as we saw the rainbow through the driving rain, as we danced and sang and shouted and chatted a different story, as rich and poor, young and old, environmentalists and anti-poverty campaigners, people of all faiths and people of no faith, became a collective sea of humanity calling for something different. The penny that began to drop, it's this: that there is hope. Oscar Romero, the murdered El Salvadorian archbishop, stated that if he was gunned down, he would rise again in the people. He was gunned down. He did rise again in the people. There is hope. I began to realize, after 26 meetings of the Conference of the Parties, we are probably asking the impossible of the nations of the world. We're asking them to put the interests of others before the interests of their own. And we don't appoint or even elect them to do that. Of course, that's not a reason that we stop demanding such a change of heart. Stop expecting such a miracle, because we need a miracle. But I think we need to start looking for and acting for a miracle somewhere else. And many of us are already doing that. One of the things I learned a little bit about during COP26 was about the Marrakesh Partnership. This is a formal part of the process, but it's a collaboration between those who are not formally part of the COP. It includes, for example, London, Scotland, and a host of organisations that are subnational and international. At the gathering, at the session of the Marrakesh Partnership that I attended, Vanessa, that Manny talked about earlier, was one of the speakers. This is an astonishing group of people. These are the places, the organizations, the movements where their actions genuinely matter. And it is in there, in the midst of this, that I think perhaps churches and faith communities might have a place, a part to play. If we're humble enough, if we're generous enough, and if we're willing to get off the fence and be genuinely prophetic. If we're willing to face up to questions about how we spend our money, whose voice we choose to amplify, and who we take sides with. These things matter. Are there grounds for optimism? Probably not. At the current levels, we are already seeing the precariousness being brought about by global warming, currently at 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. If 1.5 remains just about within reach, it is most certainly on life support. It's taken 26 COPs for us to finally mention coal. And nobody mentioned oil. After a decade, we still haven't delivered on a promise that we made to the global south. Time is running out. This isn't the time for waiting, if by waiting we mean sitting, twiddling our thumbs, fiddling while the earth burns. Are there grounds for hope? Well, that's a whole different question. A question answered by the young mothers from the Amazon I spent time speaking with while sitting on the floor of the conference venue. A question answered by James Bagwan from Fiji as he travelled back to his country, refusing to be angry and refusing to give up. A question answered by Young Christian Climate Network as they carried a boat from Truro to Glasgow. A question answered by the gentle and prophetic humility of someone like Archbishop Julio Murray. A question answered, a question yet to be answered by the likes of you and me, by what we do, by what we say, by how we say it, by how we go about it. A question answered in this time of active preparing, not passive waiting for the light to come into the world. Maybe in the lament there is hope. But it is not in the hanging about waiting for others to change their ways. It is in the preparing the way, living the alternative, working deliberately for the light that's coming into the darkness of the world. Let's get to it. Amen.